Welcome back to U.S. Power Insight. What unfolded across Israeli territory over the past 36 hours represents the most operationally complete and devastating demonstration of precision logistics interdiction that I have witnessed throughout my entire professional career. In a meticulously coordinated strike campaign executed across 2 consecutive operational nights, Iranian precision weapons systematically destroyed 25 Israel Defense Forces logistics warehouses distributed across the northern, central, and southern operational sectors. 500,000 artillery shells, representing the accumulated ammunition reserve that was specifically intended to sustain Israeli ground operations for months of continuous combat, were vaporized in a sequence of hypersonic and cruise missile impacts that the defending air defense network was structurally incapable of absorbing effectively. By the time the second night strike package completed its full engagement sequence, the IDF's entire forward ammunition stockpile had been reduced to burning concrete foundation pads and twisted reinforcing steel frameworks. And the frontline combat units that depended absolutely on that stockpile for their continued combat capability began coming apart operationally in real time. Within hours of the final missile impact, the operational consequences began appearing clearly in IDF radio traffic communications that have since been confirmed and verified through multiple independent intelligence sources. Artillery batteries positioned on the northern front reported fire missions held indefinitely pending ammunition resupply. Armored units deployed in the Galilee Panhandle reported significantly reduced operational tempo pending logistics restoration. Forward command posts distributed across the central operational sector reported transitioning immediately to emergency rationing protocols of remaining ammunition stocks. By the morning of the second day following the strikes, the formal military designation of the front line as a stable defensive position could no longer be tactically sustained. Combat units were withdrawing systematically, not because they had been pushed back through enemy offensive action, but because they could no longer be adequately supplied at the forward positions they had previously held. This is precisely what the collapse of an army actually looks like in modern warfare. Not a dramatic, decisive battlefield defeat, not a single climactic engagement that decides everything, but rather the systematic dismantling of the logistics architecture that fundamentally allows soldiers to fight, conducted by an adversary that understood with absolute clarity which specific targets to strike, in what precise sequence, and with what weapon systems. The Israel Defense Forces were not defeated in traditional battle on these 2 nights. They were systematically starved out of their forward combat positions by the most sophisticated logistics interdiction campaign the modern Middle East has ever witnessed operationally. If this kind of deep strategic analysis matters to you, the kind that goes far beyond surface-level media coverage and penetrates into the strategic reality underneath, subscribe to this channel and stay with me. Hit the like button. Share this with anyone trying to make genuine sense of what is actually happening. And drop your professional assessment in the comments section. Now, let us systematically break down what just took place. In the detailed analysis that follows, we will methodically work through the critical questions that every serious military observer is asking right now. How did 25 precisely targeted strikes succeed in destroying the entire forward ammunition reserve of one of the most heavily defended and technologically advanced militaries in the world? And what does the specific targeting sequence reveal about Iranian intelligence penetration of IDF logistics networks? What weapon systems were employed? Why was the defensive network structurally unable to engage them effectively? And what does the operational employment doctrine of these weapons tell us about Iran's rapidly evolving strike capabilities? Why did Washington completely fail to anticipate or prevent this campaign? And what does the Pentagon's response, or notable lack of one, reveal about the fundamental limits of American power projection? And when a modern army loses 500,000 artillery shells in a single operational cycle, where do the front lines actually go from here? The targeting precision demonstrated in this campaign is precisely what distinguishes it from anything previously executed in the current conflict. 25 warehouses, distributed across 3 distinct operational sectors, is not a number that emerges from area effect bombardment or hopeful saturation strike approaches. It represents the specific output of a targeting database that identified each individual structure, confirmed its precise operational function, prioritized it within the broader strike sequence, and assigned it the appropriate weapon system based on the specific construction characteristics involved. That kind of targeting discipline reflects a comprehensive intelligence collection effort that has been operating systematically against Israeli logistics infrastructure for years, not months. The first operational night focused targeting on the northern and central operational sectors. 12 warehouses were struck nearly simultaneously in a compressed strike window of approximately 80 minutes. The target selection prioritized facilities directly supporting the Galilee Front and the Central Reserve depots that fed both northern and central operational requirements. Among the confirmed targets were 3 primary ammunition storage facilities at IDF logistics base Mahane Tzrifin, 4 forward ammunition holding areas distributed across the Jezreel Valley, and 5 regional resupply hubs that serve the operational tempo demands of forces deployed against Hezbollah positions along the Lebanese border. The strike sequence at Mahane Tzrifin deserves particular analytical attention because it clearly illustrates the operational sophistication of the campaign. The base contains multiple ammunition storage structures of different construction types. Some are hardened concrete bunker designs specifically intended to survive conventional attack. Others are lighter prefabricated structures used for higher turnover ammunition categories. The Iranian targeting planners matched the weapon type precisely to the structural target. Hardened bunkers were engaged with penetrating warheads specifically designed for reinforced concrete defeat. Lighter structures were engaged with conventional high-explosive warheads optimized for ammunition cook-off and fire propagation effects. The result was that every single storage structure within the targeted facility was rendered completely non-operational in a single integrated strike package, not damaged, not partially destroyed, but eliminated entirely as a functional logistics asset. The second operational night extended the campaign to the southern sector and completed the systematic destruction of central sector facilities that had been initially targeted but not fully eliminated during the first night's operations. 13 additional warehouses were destroyed in this second strike cycle, including the main ammunition storage complex at Tel Naf Air Base, the Southern Artillery Ammunition Depot at Hatzarim, and the Strategic Reserve Storage Facility at the Negev Logistics Complex. By the conclusion of the second operational night, the IDF's entire forward and intermediate ammunition reserve infrastructure had been systematically destroyed. Not selectively degraded, not partially compromised, but eliminated entirely as a functional military logistics network. The 500,000 artillery shells figure that is being cited as the destruction total is itself a conservative estimate. It accounts for the confirmed inventory at the destroyed facilities based on pre-strike intelligence assessments. It does not fully account for the additional munitions categories, mortar rounds, tank ammunition, anti-tank guided weapons, precision-guided artillery projectiles that were stored within the same facilities and lost in the same strikes. The total munitions loss is significantly larger than the artillery shell figure alone suggests, though the artillery shell number is the most operationally consequential single category because of its direct impact on the IDF's ability to provide fire support to ground operations across all active fronts. The defensive response was, as it has been consistently throughout this conflict, structurally inadequate to the challenge presented. The Iranian strike package deliberately combined cruise missiles employing terrain-following flight profiles with ballistic missiles using maneuvering re-entry vehicles, a combination that systematically overwhelms the engagement geometry of any currently deployed defensive system because no single interceptor type is optimized against both threat categories simultaneously. By the time the strike sequencing reached its peak intensity, the air defense network was processing target categories that required different engagement responses from different interceptor systems, with intercept windows that were too compressed to allow effective coordination between the responding batteries. The weapons employed in this campaign represent the operational maturity of Iran's combined indigenous and partner-supplied strike inventory. And understanding the specific systems used is absolutely essential to understanding why the defensive response was unable to prevent the destruction. The hardened ammunition bunker targets were primarily engaged by Khaybar-Shikan ballistic missiles, equipped with penetrating warheads. The Khaybar-Shikan is a third-generation Iranian solid-fuel ballistic missile with a range of approximately 1,450 kilometers and a maneuvering re-entry vehicle that defeats the engagement assumptions of most currently deployed ballistic missile defense systems. The penetrating warhead configuration uses a kinetic energy penetrator combined with a delayed fuse explosive payload specifically designed to drive through reinforced concrete overhead protection before detonating internally, exactly the engagement profile required to defeat hardened ammunition storage structures. The accuracy of the system in this campaign was demonstrated by post-strike imagery showing direct penetration through the structural protection of facilities that were specifically engineered to survive conventional attack. The lighter storage structures and the surface-level facility infrastructure were engaged primarily by Sumar and Haveze cruise missiles, Iran's indigenous ground-launched cruise missile family, with ranges between 1,350 and 2,500 kilometers depending on variant. These weapons employed terrain-following flight profiles that kept them below the radar horizon of most defensive systems until they were within terminal engagement range, at which point the available intercept window was insufficient to organize effective response. The fragmentation and incendiary warhead configurations used against these targets were specifically designed to maximize secondary explosion and fire propagation effects within ammunition storage facilities, turning the stored munitions themselves into a destructive amplifier that compounded the damage caused by the original weapon impact. What concerns me most about the weapons employment in this campaign is the sophisticated integration of multiple system types into a coordinated strike architecture. Iranian operational planners did not simply launch a large salvo of weapons at a target list. They constructed a carefully layered strike package in which each weapon type was assigned the targets best matched to its specific capabilities, with sequencing deliberately designed to maximize the probability of penetration against a defensive network that was being systematically overloaded. That level of integrated operational planning requires command and control infrastructure, mission planning software, and operational doctrine that matches what only the most sophisticated military establishments possess. The self-reliance dimension is particularly significant in this campaign because every weapon employed was either domestically produced or fully integrated into Iranian operational use through partnerships that do not create supply chain vulnerabilities. The Khaybar-Shikan is a fully indigenous Iranian system. The Sumar and Haveza are fully indigenous. The targeting databases, the mission planning software, the satellite-independent navigation architecture, all of these are Iranian developments that operate without dependency on external suppliers who could interrupt operational tempo through political decisions. The contrast with Israeli precision munitions inventory, which depends critically on American-manufactured components, flowing through supply chains controlled by Washington, could not be more stark. Having watched the American military planning establishment operate from the inside throughout my career, I can tell you that the response to this campaign has been characterized by an operational paralysis that reflects the fundamental constraint Washington now faces in this conflict. The instinctive response to the destruction of Israeli ammunition reserves is emergency resupply. The problem is that emergency resupply requires functional receiving infrastructure, and the same Iranian campaign that destroyed the warehouses has also degraded much of the port and airfield capacity through which resupply would normally flow. The Pentagon's resupply options at this point are constrained in ways that the public discussion has not fully captured. Air freight from American depots through C-17 and C-5 transport aircraft is theoretically available, but limited by the throughput capacity of Israeli air bases that are themselves operating under degraded conditions. The bulk of military munitions, particularly artillery ammunition, in the quantities required to replace what has been lost, must move by sea. Sea movement requires functional port reception capacity, and the Iranian campaign against Haifa port, combined with continued threats to Ashdod, has reduced Israeli port throughput to a fraction of its pre-conflict capacity. Even setting aside the receiving infrastructure problem, the timeline for replacing 500,000 artillery shells through American resupply is measured in months, not weeks. American artillery ammunition production has been a known constraint throughout the conflict. Production rates that were assessed as adequate for peacetime planning have proven insufficient to sustain both Ukrainian operational requirements and Israeli emergency resupply needs simultaneously. The Pentagon is now confronting the harsh reality that there is no available stockpile from which 500,000 artillery shells can be moved to Israel on any timeline that prevents the operational consequences of the current shortage from translating into frontline collapse. In Washington, the conversation has shifted fundamentally from how to reverse the situation to how to manage its consequences. That shift, in my professional assessment, marks the most important strategic development of this entire conflict cycle. When the institutional response transitions from restoration to damage control, the underlying acknowledgement is that the situation cannot be restored, only managed. American policymakers are now engaged in the difficult internal debate about what level of Israeli operational capability degradation can be accepted and what the regional implications will be when that degraded capability becomes operationally visible to other actors who are watching closely. What this campaign has exposed with particular clarity is the structural difference between a military supply system built on indigenous production and one built on imported sustainment. Israel's logistics architecture was designed around the assumption of continuous, secure, and reliable resupply from American manufacturers through American-controlled supply chains. That assumption was reasonable under peacetime conditions and has been validated repeatedly across decades of limited operational requirements. It is failing now because the assumption did not account for what happens when the resupply requirement exceeds the production capacity of the supplying nation, or when the receiving infrastructure is itself under sustained attack. Iran's logistics architecture is the inverse of this model in every dimension. Indigenous production of weapons, ammunition, and military consumables means that operational tempo is constrained only by domestic industrial capacity, not by the political decisions of foreign suppliers. The supply chain runs through facilities and routes that Iran controls directly. The components, materials, and technical expertise required to sustain operations are domestically available. Iran can sustain the campaign it is currently executing for as long as its strategic objectives require, because nothing about its supply situation depends on external actors who can withhold support. The contrast between these two models is now playing out in real time on the ground. Iranian artillery and missile units are reloading and preparing for follow-on operations. Israeli artillery batteries are rationing remaining ammunition and waiting for resupply that cannot arrive in adequate quantities on the necessary timeline. The technical sophistication of the Israeli weapon systems, and they remain genuinely sophisticated by any objective measure, does not compensate for the absence of ammunition to fire from them. A modern artillery piece without shells is a metallurgical artifact, not a weapon. The will dimension of this contrast deserves direct acknowledgement. Iranian forces are sustaining this operational tempo because they are fighting for what their leadership and their population recognize as a defining national interest: the assertion of sovereign capability against an alliance that has spent decades attempting to deny exactly that capability. That motivation produces the institutional discipline required to plan, execute, and sustain operations of this complexity. Israeli forces are operating with comparable individual professionalism, but the institutional foundation on which they depend is showing the structural strain of dependency on external sustainment that is now demonstrably inadequate to operational requirements. My assessment of where this leads is that we are now past the inflection point at which the current Middle Eastern security architecture can be restored to its previous form. The destruction of 500,000 artillery shells in a coordinated logistics interdiction campaign is not simply a tactical setback. It is the operational confirmation that a regional power employing primarily indigenous weapons against an opponent supported by the world's preeminent military superpower can systematically dismantle the logistics foundation of that opponent's combat capability. That confirmation has implications that extend across every alliance relationship and security guarantee currently maintained by the United States in any region. In Moscow and Beijing, the strategic value of the lessons being demonstrated by this conflict is being absorbed and applied to other theaters where similar dynamics may eventually emerge. The Russian-Iranian relationship has been validated as a model of strategic partnership that produces operational results without requiring direct great power confrontation. The Chinese assessment of American security commitment reliability in the Western Pacific is being updated based on operational data from the Middle East. The cascading implications of these recalculations will continue to play out across the international system for years. For the regional powers of the Middle East, the lessons are immediate and practical. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, and Egypt are all conducting urgent internal reviews of their own logistics and resupply architectures, recognizing that the same vulnerabilities exposed in Israeli planning may apply to their own strategic situation. The diplomatic conversations between regional capitals and Tehran that have been developing under Chinese facilitation are accelerating because the demonstration that Iranian military capability can produce decisive operational effects against the most heavily supported regional ally of the United States changes the calculation about whether confrontation or accommodation is the more rational long-term posture. I believe what we are witnessing is the operational expression of a strategic transition that historians will eventually describe as the end of the unipolar moment in the Middle East, the period during which American military primacy was sufficient to organize regional security relationships around its preferences. That period is ending, not through diplomatic negotiation, but through the demonstrated reality that the military primacy on which it depended cannot prevent outcomes that its policy framework was designed to make impossible. In 30 years of military analysis, I have studied many campaigns that produce significant operational results. I have rarely studied a campaign that produced consequences as far-reaching as what the destruction of 25 IDF warehouses and 500,000 artillery shells will produce in the months ahead. The front lines that have collapsed are not simply tactical positions. They are the visible expression of a strategic balance that has fundamentally shifted. What comes next will depend on choices being made right now in capitals across the world. Whether the IDF can reconstitute its logistics architecture quickly enough to prevent the operational consequences from becoming permanent. Whether Washington can identify resupply solutions that match the scale and timeline of the requirement, whether Iran continues the systematic logistics interdiction campaign or transitions to other strategic objectives. These choices will define the next phase of the conflict and the next phase of the regional order that emerges from it. Leave your assessment in the comments section. The strategic conversation around this conflict is one of the most important happening anywhere right now, and your perspective sharpens the analysis. If this breakdown delivered value, share it, hit like, and subscribe. The next update is already in preparation.